The age after Galileo and Kepler, by the early 1600s, the telescope had already transformed the human relationship with the heavens. Hans Lippershey had brought a curious little spyglass into the world. Galileo Galilei had turned it toward the sky and shocked Europe with his observations, and Johannes Kepler had reimagined its design with his convex eyepiece. For the first time in history, humans were not merely guessing at the nature of the cosmos, they were seeing it. But, as with all great inventions, the telescope of Galileo and Kepler was only the beginning. Their instruments were groundbreaking, yet they had flaws. The Galilean telescope had a painfully narrow field of view, much like trying to peer through a drinking straw. The Keplerian design gave sharper images, but inverted them, great for astronomy, confusing for anyone trying to use it to spot an incoming army or a ship on the horizon. Chromatic aberration, that annoying rainbow halo around bright objects, plagued early refracting telescopes. And worst of all, building larger lenses to collect more light was an engineering nightmare. Heavy, unwieldy, and prone to sagging under their own weight. So, the 17th century was faced with a challenge: how to take the telescope from a fragile curiosity into a serious scientific instrument. The next steps would be driven by brilliant mathematicians, daring lens grinders, and at least one man who decided mirrors might work better than glass. And so begins the tale of Christiaan Huygens, Isaac Newton, and the restless innovators who refused to stop at good enough. Christiaan Huygens, the Dutch genius with a long view. Christiaan Huygens, 1629 to 1695, was born into a wealthy and intellectual family his father, Constantijn Huygens, was a poet, diplomat, and close friend of philosophers like Descartes. Surrounded by such intellectual firepower, it's little wonder that young Christiaan grew up to be one of the most versatile minds of the 17th century. He would eventually contribute to physics, mathematics, and astronomy, and telescopes would be his favorite toys. By the 1650s, the telescope had spread across Europe, but astronomers were still battling its limitations. Most refractors, the lens-based telescopes, produced distorted, color-fringed images. Huygens and his brother Constantijn Jr. set out to build better ones. They became skilled lens grinders, crafting longer and longer telescopes to reduce chromatic aberration. And when I say longer, I mean ridiculously longer. Some Huygens telescopes stretched 50 feet in length. Imagine trying to align a telescope longer than a blue whale. Astronomers had to suspend the lenses between poles and ropes, often outdoors, making observations highly dependent on weather. A gust of wind. Congratulations, your telescope is now a giant kite. Rain. Well, your carefully polished lenses are ruined. But despite the awkwardness, these super long refractors worked. In 1655, using a telescope he and his brother built, Christiaan Huygens discovered Titan, the largest moon of Saturn. He also sketched Saturn's mysterious appendages, which had baffled Galileo. Huygens correctly interpreted them as a ring system surrounding the planet. In his honor, the European Space Agency would later name its Titan lander Huygens. To make observing easier, Huygens also developed new eyepiece designs. His most famous was the Huygenian eyepiece, consisting of two plano-convex lenses which reduced chromatic aberration and improved clarity. Variations of this design are still used today in simple telescopes and microscopes. Not bad for a 17th century tinkerer. Huygens represents the maximum refractor era, the belief that building longer and longer telescopes would eventually solve all problems. But physics had other ideas. While length helped reduce color distortions, the impracticality of wielding telescopes as long as a city street soon forced astronomers to rethink. Enter a man who decided lenses were overrated. Isaac Newton, the mirror master. In 1668, a 25-year-old Isaac Newton unveiled an invention that would change telescope design forever: the reflecting telescope. Instead of using lenses to bend light, Newton used a concave mirror to gather and focus it. Why mirrors? Newton was a man obsessed with light. He spent years conducting experiments by shining beams through prisms, eventually proving that white light was made of many colors. He also realized that chromatic aberration, the rainbow smearing that plagued refracting telescopes, was caused by light refracting differently at different wavelengths. Lenses would always bend colors unequally. Mirrors, however, reflected all colors in the same way. That meant no chromatic aberration. Newton's conclusion: ditch the lenses, use mirrors instead. His design was compact and elegant. 1. A concave mirror gathered light at the bottom of the tube. 2. A small diagonal mirror redirected the focused light to an eyepiece at the side. This configuration solved several problems at once. It eliminated chromatic aberration, allowed for larger apertures without the sagging issues of long lenses, and made telescopes shorter and easier to handle. Newton's first prototype had a mirror just 2 inches across, but it was revolutionary. Of course, being Newton, he didn't stop at inventing a telescope. He also hand-polished his own mirrors from a special alloy of tin and copper. Imagine one of the greatest scientific minds in history hunched over, sweating in candle light, grinding metal into a parabolic curve for months. This was DIY science at its finest. And it worked. Newton demonstrated his reflecting telescope to the Royal Society in 1671, where it caused a sensation. Finally, here was a telescope design that could be scaled up without turning into a 100-foot monster dangling from ropes. Reflectors would eventually dominate astronomy, from William Herschel's enormous 40-foot telescope to today's colossal observatories. But in Newton's time, his reflectors faced skepticism. Many astronomers were already invested literally and emotionally in refracting telescopes. Some criticized the small size of Newton's mirrors or complained that polishing them to perfection was too difficult. And let's be honest, Newton wasn't exactly a people person. His prickly personality didn't help him win over critics. But history vindicated him. Today, nearly every major research telescope, from the Keck twins in Hawaii to the James Webb Space Telescope, follows Newton's reflecting principle. Reflectors versus refractors, a 17th century debate. The emergence of Newton's reflector didn't instantly kill refractors. In fact, the two designs coexisted and competed for centuries. Each had strengths and weaknesses. Refractors' lenses, sharper images, simpler alignment, and resistant to surface tarnish. But they suffered from chromatic aberration and became impractical at large sizes. Reflectors' mirrors, no chromatic aberration, scalable to large sizes, shorter tubes. But mirrors were tricky to polish, tarnished over time, and often needed repolishing. In the 1600s and 1700s, most astronomers stuck with refractors for their reliability. Reflectors were admired, but grinding perfect mirrors was a painstaking art. It wasn't until the 18th century, with new metal alloys and better polishing methods, that reflectors began to rise in prominence. In some sense, the refractor versus reflector debate mirrored, pun intended, many tech debates today. Vinyl versus digital, film versus digital cameras, or even iPhone versus Android. Each side had passionate defenders, but progress eventually chose the path of scalability. For telescopes, reflectors won the long game. The problems of early telescopes, it's worth pausing to appreciate just how absurd some early telescopes were. The Huygens brothers' 50-foot refractors required ropes, pulleys, and towers just to point at the sky. Imagine an astronomer shouting, "Quick, Saturn's in position, somebody crank the winch." Meanwhile, Newton's little reflector was compact enough to sit on a tabletop, but the mirror would tarnish in weeks. Every time he wanted a clear view, Newton had to grind and polish it again. It's a bit like owning a sports car that requires rebuilding the engine after every drive. And let's not forget the poor assistants tasked with holding telescopes steady in the wind. Observing Jupiter's moons is a lot less magical when you're also wrestling with a 30-foot wooden pole trying not to impale your colleagues. Science may be grand, but in the 17th century, it was often downright slapstick.
By the end of the 1600s, telescopes had come a long way from Lippershey's simple spyglass. Huygens had stretched them to absurd lengths to reduce distortions, discovering moons and rings in the process. Newton had boldly reinvented the telescope with mirrors, planting the seeds of modern astronomy. And Europe was abuzz with debates, experiments. But the story was only beginning. The 18th century would bring new innovations: achromatic lenses to tame color distortion, massive telescopes built by William Herschel, and eventually the awe-inspiring Leviathan of Parsonstown. The age of big telescopes was dawning, and humanity's window into the universe was about to get much, much larger. And that wraps up of our epic journey through the history of telescopes. We started with the world after Galileo and Kepler, when the telescope was still more of an optical curiosity than a polished scientific instrument. We saw Christian Huygens stretching refractors to ridiculous lengths. Seriously, some of his telescopes were longer than whales, and using them to discover Titan, Saturn's biggest moon, and even decode Saturn's bizarre rings. Then, we watched as Isaac Newton decided to toss out the lens playbook entirely and invent something brand new: the reflecting telescope. Compact, powerful, and free from the color-smearing problems of refractors, Newton's design would go on to inspire nearly every major telescope we use today. What's fascinating about this era is the sheer human determination. These early scientists weren't working with million-dollar labs or space agencies. They were grinding glass and metal by hand, hoisting giant tubes into the air with ropes, and battling the weather just to get a shaky glimpse of Saturn or Jupiter. Every discovery was a hard-earned victory, and each improvement laid the groundwork for the next great leap. And, of course, we can't ignore the humor in all this. Huygens' 50-foot telescopes were so impractical they might as well have been medieval siege weapons. Newton's mirrors tarnished so quickly he probably spent more time polishing than observing. Yet these awkward, clumsy, and sometimes hilarious experiments are exactly what pushed astronomy forward. It's a reminder that progress often looks messy in the moment, but history remembers the breakthroughs, not the blisters. If you enjoyed this second chapter of the telescope story, make sure to drop a like, leave a comment, and let me know, which do you think was the bigger leap: Huygens' monster refractors or Newton's compact reflector? I'd love to hear your take on which of these innovations really set astronomy on the path we know today. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell, because the next part of this series will take us deeper into the golden age of telescopes and the discoveries that reshaped our view of the universe. Until then, keep looking up and maybe polish a mirror or two, just in honor of Sir Isaac. See you in part 2.